This week's data breach is brought to you by the fine folks at ChatGPT. We have talked about ChatGPT and some of the risks there. We've talked about how hackers have been using it to write malware, which is kind of entertaining. And we've talked about how companies are accidentally loading their intellectual property into ChatGPT and leaking data out. So we've talked about that. But now it's just a straight up traditional breach. Hackers were able to gain access to some ChatGPT systems, allowing them to view the conversation histories for random people they couldn't pick. So it was just like random samplings of conversations, as well as gain access to some payment details for the 5 people like myself that actually pay for ChatGPT.
You pay for ChatGPT?
I do pay for it.
Can I have your login?
Well, you get the ChatGPT 4, right? So you get the upgraded.
It is the nice
greatest
one.
That's why I pay for it.
But when they say chat history, are we talking about your prompt queries? How you so they're seeing those. So you
And
come
the
up with the latest and greatest. They can just export those and use them for themselves.
Yeah, and I think I made a joke about this before. Prompt engineer is like a new emerging job.
Sure.
Like, knowing the right prompt to use with ChatGPT can get you significantly better results. So seeing somebody else's prompts can, one, tell you about that person and what they're doing, compromising their privacy and so on. But two, it can give you techniques that you might not have had access to before to get better results out of ChatGPT.
Wow.
Sure. And how about the companies that are actually kind of laying over their products over
Yeah.
AI engines like this? Now they potentially have their information exposed.
Right. And the intention here is if they're just using the ChatGPT API and doing calls, then that's their own fault. Like that's that company's fault. They shouldn't have done that. Instead, what you're supposed to do is license the model from ChatGPT or from OpenAI, and then you can train it on your data as well in a proprietary data model that you keep yourself.
Okay.
Right. That isn't available in the general ChatGPT. So that's the result. Like what you're describing, Wes, is when companies are not using ChatGPT the right way.
Okay.
But tons of companies are doing it.
Okay, yeah. So it's not the fact that they haven't given you some tools; people aren't yet leveraging those models.
Yeah. Or if you are Samsung, because I think this did happen to Samsung or Sony, one of the S words. I think it was Samsung, where they started using ChatGPT, or some of their internal employees were doing it, and they were doing it with free accounts. And so whatever you do in a free account, that trains the model. And so you're leaking data out. That's not how that was intended to be used. So, if Samsung is going to use it, they should be buying it, having their own private trained model. But this is where we get into shadow IT. How do you stop your employees from doing stuff like that?
You hit them with your car.
You could.
They will never do that again. I do not condone violence.
By the way, we have a job opening.
So the question is, how do you track if people are using it other than some of the traditional things? Like, for instance, you don't want people going to YouTube on your computers at work. Like, do we start blacklisting everything?
So this is not a AI like generative. This is not a new problem. This is an old problem,
Sure.
right?
Okay.
How do you know if some of your employees haven't set up a WhatsApp private chat group? Right? You could have 50 employees that all signed up for WhatsApp, and the IT department doesn't even know about it. And they did it via the web browser, so it's not like you see crazy ports open or anything like that. And now they've got end-to-end encrypted chats, and you have no visibility into it. You have no idea, are they pushing out company secrets? If an employee leaves the company, they still have access to that WhatsApp group. Like, how do you stop that?
That's not an easy thing to do.
Threats of violence.
Yeah. If we
know how Dan
out
does
you're
it.
doing this, it's going to be bad. Now, from what I understand, the breach itself was through an open source library that they were using to connect to Redis. Is this correct on this?
Yeah, Redis super popular amongst
Very.
web apps, right? Because if you have to track session data when a user closes their browser and opens it again.
This makes it fast.
Yeah. Or if they, open multiple tabs and so on, you got to be able to track that session. Redis does a great job of it, very fast, cache the sessions. And there was a bug where if they would interrupt a query at just the right point, that it would actually feed them data from someone else's session. And that's that random part. Like, they couldn't pick somebody, but if they could abuse the system enough, they could possibly get data from every session.
Which is interesting, though, because, this is an open source library. This is something that anybody could be using, and people were just I'll say researchers, we'll call them attackers because they did an attack. They found that in that open source library there was a flaw, and they were then able to interface through ChatGPT to gain access into that library and exploit the flaw that way. And according to this article, it says that attacks on open source libraries have increased by 742% since 2019 because of this very reason. We have increased our use of open source libraries, and therefore going, I mean, you're Don. You're part of a large-ish corporation. What's the policy on using open source libraries?
So first off, for companies, you have to understand the license of that library, because some of them say if you build on top of it, like you got to release your code too.
Oh, right.
And so there's exactly a legal obligation that happens there. So you got to be careful with it. But otherwise, for a corporation, you'd be a fool not to use some of these libraries because they're already made and you didn't have to pay for them, right? But there was an XKCD comic. If you ever look for this one, XKCD, it's number 2347, and it's called Dependency. And what it shows is like, it says all modern digital infrastructure, and it shows all these big blocks. And then there's this tiny little block at the bottom supporting the whole thing. It says, a project some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. And that's how it works, right? Like that person in Nebraska, maybe one day they just say, all right, I'm done. And they walk away. And so now you've got a library that hasn't been updated in years and has vulnerabilities in it. But at a minimum, like huge companies, IBM, Cisco, Microsoft can depend on these libraries. Meanwhile, this person hasn't made a dime off of it. And that's the open source world. That's how it works.
Well, wasn't there like a while back, we did an article on somebody that was maintaining an open source repo, and they like hosed it or did
on purpose.
They totally debagged out and like, I'll teach you, make a bunch of money and not spend any my way or whatever the case was. I forget what it was.
And that was one where some people were like, he should go to jail for that. And there is an argument there. But from his perspective, he's like, hey, I've been doing this free thing all this time, and F you, buddy.
Yeah. Well, there's that.
Yeah. Good times on that one.
Yeah. So, use open source repos responsibly and with caution.
Unless you work for JP Morgan Chase. Because apparently the article also says they're restricting employees' use of ChatGPT.
Well, and they should.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a hospital, if you are, financial,
finance, insurance, sure.
Yeah. Anybody that deals with PII, like you don't want that data leaking.
Sure.
Out. That's a problem.
So I should take down that website. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. That's probably the real lesson to learn here is like, not that ChatGPT got breached, because people get breached all the time, right? It's you cannot trust a service like ChatGPT to keep your data private. And it's really tempting to give these AI systems a lot of your data because then they make better suggestions and better recommendations. But that is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it is. And if you live by it, well, you know the rest.
Yeah. and you have to remember with like GDPR and all that, if you have data on a person from Europe, and you feed that into ChatGPT, well, ChatGPT just became a sub-processor for you.
Yeah.
You just handed data to a sub-processor without the customer's authorization.
Didn't Italy like ban the use of ChatGPT for a while, and because
for a little
they
while.
Were worried about privacy concerns?
Yep, just until the bribes came through, and then they opened it back up.
Oh, the check cleared, so I guess you can come on in.
and I don't think I'm held to journalistic standards here, but just to be clear, I do not know for a fact that bribes were handed off. But it sure was odd. They banned it for like 7 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the guy that banned it started driving around in a brand new Ferrari.
They can get those locally.
No import tax on that.